The only light in the gloomy living room was the small lamp atop the wooden side table. Alice sat on the red couch, her elbows on her knees and her face in her hands. Jenna sat next to her, gazing at her lap and twiddling her thumbs. Alice and Jenna, nearly ready to fall asleep, had been doing almost nothing but putting up missing posters the whole day. They tried to put them on the most populated areas of Hurricane, like the stores and libraries. Alice and Jenna both dialed everyone they knew and asked every question that came to mind. They echoed in Alice's head. "Where is he? What happened? When did you last see him? Have you heard anything?" Both girls startled as the doorbell rang. Alice shot up and dashed toward the front door. Jenna threw the red blanket off of her lap and almost lost her balance as she took off after her mother. Alice frantically swung the door open, almost slamming it into the red wall, to see Anthony standing on the front deck. She blurted, "Did you find him?" Jenna's heart sank, splitting open as it crashed to the ground, grief wriggling its way inside the shattered remains. She saw the look on her father's face, and she knew the answer. Michael paced back and forth in the kitchen, his eyes constantly darting between the clock and the tiled floor. His heart pounded in his ears, his lungs restricting on desperate, ragged breaths. He flinched when he heard the phone ring. He dashed to it and answered worriedly. "Hello?" Jenna's jittery voice emerged from the speaker. "Michael, he isn't back yet." Michael glanced at the clock once more to confirm the time. 7:02. "Okay, I'm on my way." Jenna blurted, "Hurry!" The line went dead as Jenna hung up. Michael placed the phone back in its place, then tiptoed to his room. Typically, Michael stayed up until around 7:30, but Dad and Thomas were usually asleep by 7, which is why he had suggested that time to Jenna. Michael walked into his room, grabbed his rifle from the closet, and slid back the bolt to make sure that a round was chambered. Generally, he didn't ever chamber a round unless he was ready to fire, but something told him that it was just a good idea. He slid open the window, climbed through, closed it again from the other side, then ran to his bike that leaned against the wall. Red rays splayed in all directions across the gleaming orange sky, the glimmering sun sinking behind the amalgamation of gargantuan trees and towering man-made structures. Jack changed the radio station, hoping to get something calmer than heavy metal rock. His apartment was near the middle of Hurricane, where trees were less common alongside the road, but still very abundant. As he drove, he replayed the day in his mind. Jack remembered how he showed up for his training that day. He recalled how William greeted him more like a friend than an employee. Jack was given instructions and details, such as where to leave his keyring whenever he left for the night, or how to react to an uninvited guest. William led Jack to a room next to parts and service and pointed to it. "This is the back room." He turned from the door to Jack. "If you feel someone's in there, you can go inside. Otherwise," he shrugged, "it's only for specific employees. There's a lot of confidential stuff in there. Just try to make sure it's locked." Jack nodded. "Okay. And if you do have a look in there, please keep all its contents to yourself. As I said, it's all confidential. I hope you understand." Jack smiled. "Yeah, it's alright. I understand. Trust me, nobody's getting in there on my watch." He twirled his flashlight. William smiled back. "That would be very much appreciated." Jack slid one hand into the pocket of his black pants, his fingers fidgeting with a folded map he took everywhere. "So, what's next?" William checked his watch, then turned his gaze back to Jack. "It's late. We should both be getting home." Jack nodded. "Alright, good night." William gestured toward the short hall leading to the main dining area. "Good night. Have fun with all your friends." Jack chuckled. "I'm not seeing any of them tonight." William laughed as he held up his hands. "Well, have fun anyway." Chuckling, William following at his side, Jack made his way through the main dining area, then started toward the exit. As he walked, he turned his head to William. "How often do you hang out with friends?" He shrugged. "Just out of curiosity." William shrugged. "Most of my friends either moved away or have way too much work, so we don't get together often." Jack frowned. "Oh, I'm sorry." William chuckled. "It's alright. I'm happy playing with my kids." Jack smiled. "Well, that's cool. What are their names?" "Thomas and Michael." Jack returned his mind to the present as he pulled into the gigantic parking lot of the apartment complex. Unlike most parking lots near the middle of Hurricane, many of the parking spaces were separated by plots of green bushes, and trees ran along the edges of the sidewalk. Behind the apartment complex was a giant cluster of trees that Jack liked to pretend stretched on forever. It was one of the main reasons he chose that particular apartment complex. Ever since he was little, Jack loved nature and hiking. He never understood the big cities, littered with metal and concrete edifices. He would have chosen an apartment near the edge of Hurricane, maybe even one where he could see the river, if those didn't tend to be so much more expensive. Jack pulled into the covered parking and started toward the sidewalk in front of the complex. The apartment complex was immense, and sometimes made Jack feel like he was an ant or a fly. He walked up the metallic stairs that crisscrossed along the exterior of the building for 6 levels until he reached the 3rd level. Then he turned right and strolled to the door that stood just at the corner of the complex. When Jack rented his first apartment, his heart always raced at the thought of the concrete platform giving way beneath his feet. He desperately tried not to look down or over the railing, but he always found it difficult. However, after a couple years, he had gotten accustomed to it. He pulled the key from his pocket, unlocked door 107, and stepped inside. Just like everything he had ever owned, Jack's small apartment was tidy, almost spotless. Although the walls and floor of the apartment were dark blue, Jack tried to create a more red theme using various amenities. The crimson couch was in the middle of the small living room, just behind the red rug. The television set sat atop a tiny wooden table that was pressed against the back of the kitchen counter. On the far side of the room were two doorways. One led to the small bedroom, and the other led to the bathroom. Jack set his keys on the holder on the wall and slid his shoes under the rose-red table by the front door. He took a deep breath, thinking, "Home sweet home, finally." Jack walked into the bathroom and hopped into the shower. For a moment, his mind raced. He knew that he could handle the job. All he had to do was patrol the building for 6 hours every night and make sure various systems remained intact. He also knew that no one would break into the restaurant, and even if they did, then they would most likely be afraid of the night guard. Jack was just always nervous about everything. What if he messed up? What if he got fired? What if he couldn't pay for his apartment? What if? He knew that everyone was stressed like that, but it still felt like he was the only one who understood it, like he was alone, except when Jack thrust the thoughts out of his head, deciding not to think about the work that lay ahead of him tomorrow, or anything else that he found unsettling. Instead, he focused on the wonderful sensation of the warm water that was blissful to his agitated mind. He was good at that when he was at home. In his apartment, whether showering or hanging out with friends, he felt distracted, like every problem disappeared, like the joyful moment would last forever. After drying himself off and changing into new clothes, Jack walked into the kitchen. He put food in the oven, tuned the television to the local news, then crashed on the couch, laying on his side. Then he sat up, giving his full attention to the television screen, which displayed 2 pictures of missing children. For what felt like forever, the infuriating sound of bike tires against the hard asphalt road bombarded Michael's ears. Trees loomed above either side of Michael and Jenna, the branches waving in the wind like grotesque, disfigured talons, threatening to rip them from the safety of their bikes. Darkness consumed the world as the sun sank beneath the horizon, the clouds turning from a beautiful orange to a colorless gray, writhing across the sky like bony fingers. Michael and Jenna could see, but both of them had a feeling that wouldn't last long. Michael was tempted to stand up on his pedals, but was afraid to make any unnecessary movements with his rifle strapped extremely tight to his chest, and his back aching to support his heavy backpack. His hands were sore from clenching the handlebars, and his legs were starting to burn. While holding the handlebars with his left hand, he stretched his right arm and flexed his fingers, shaking his hand and relieving himself of some of the strain along his arm, feeling the pins and needles slowly dissipate. Then, he switched arms, holding the handlebars with his right hand and relieving stress from his left. If Jenna was sore or uncomfortable, she didn't show it. Jenna, who was several meters ahead of Michael, called, "Here!" Without warning, Jenna maneuvered to the right, slowing to a stop at the edge of the road. Michael stopped a few meters ahead of Jenna, then stepped off his bike, keeping a firm grip on the handlebars, calling, "You're sure?" Jenna stepped off her bike and started pulling it alongside her as she approached Michael. "Yes." She stopped a few feet from Michael and pointed behind him. Michael turned to see a speed limit sign. When he turned back to Jenna, she said, "I remember that sign." She pointed into the woods. "I think if we go straight that way, we'll reach our campsite." Michael briefly glanced around, taking in his surroundings and drawing a map in his mind. Then, he looked back at Jenna, repeating, "You're sure?" Jenna nodded. "Sure enough." She gestured to her bike. "We better hide these, just in case someone comes looking." Michael nodded. "Good idea." They guided their bikes down the small slope. Then behind a cluster of bushes, then leaned them against a tree. Michael grabbed the handle of his rifle and rubbed his sore shoulder. Jenna pulled the red flashlight from her pocket, checked the battery, then slid it back into her pocket. Michael thought about bringing a flashlight, but just in case he would need both hands to use his rifle, he decided on a headlamp. Jenna pointed into the woods again. "Come on, follow me." Michael swung his rifle back over his shoulder and followed Jenna into the woods, leaves and branches crunching beneath their boots. Michael noticed they were heading toward the fading sun and made a mental note that they were heading west. Jenna started jogging, frequently checking back to make sure that Michael was still following and matching her speed. After a while, Michael asked, "So, what were you guys doing here?" Jenna, not slowing her pace, stared at Michael. "Why does that matter?" Michael shrugged. "Maybe there was something he really wanted to do in the morning?" Jenna returned her attention to her navigation. "He wanted to go swimming, but Mom already checked the river. He wouldn't go swimming away from the campsite." She took a quick breath, exhaling her words like a long sigh. "I don't know why he'd go anywhere without me or Mom or Dad. I don't know what he would do." Jenna closed her eyes tightly, wiping the tears from her cheeks. When she opened her eyes again, she moved slightly to her right to avoid hitting a tree further ahead. Michael spoke as reassuringly as he could while his lungs were strained from jogging. "We'll find him." Jenna sighed, trying not to cry as she mumbled, "I hope so." The soft wind blew torrents of leaves across the small parking lot. Kelly sat in the passenger seat, swiping her brown hair, gleaming in the sunlight that glimmered in the car mirrors. She looked at Jack with her beautiful, emerald green eyes, and gave him a gorgeous smile. Then, she leaned over and kissed him on the cheek. He kissed her on the lips, and she kissed back. As they pulled away, then hugged, Kelly said, "I love you." Jack kept his voice low because, in the hug, he was next to Kelly's ear. "I love you too." Jack pulled out of the hug to kiss Kelly again, then froze, his hair standing on end and his heart hammering. Blood surged from Kelly's hollow eye sockets. With a snapping of bone, her head began collapsing in on itself as her face melted, blood and innards seeping through her disintegrating skin and oozing down her withering body. Jack jolted awake with a heavy gasp. It took him a moment to make out his surroundings before everything came back to him. He had fallen asleep on the couch, the television set still tuned to the local news broadcast. He glanced at the clock that hung above the fridge in the kitchen. He had only been asleep for a few minutes. Jack stood up and walked to the television set. After adjusting the antenna, he strolled around the counter and into the kitchen, then checked the food in the oven. He decided that it needed a few more minutes, and took leftovers from the fridge. He sat back down on the couch and tried to let himself get absorbed into the crime show that happened to be playing on the television. He hoped that it would wash the anxiety out of his mind before he had to fall asleep again. Michael asked, "This is it?" Jenna glanced around frantically. "I think so." She didn't sound convinced. The nearly pitch-black river was flowing somewhat slowly, but Michael knew that not too far upstream it was cascading rapidly. He could tell by the sounds of crashing water echoing in the distance, competing with the obnoxious crickets and occasional owls. The sun hadn't completely set, but it might as well have. Michael's eyes were adjusted to the blackness, and he could see good enough. Jenna could too, but kept her flashlight handy as darkness slowly writhed over them, the tall trees casting long, fading shadows across the ground. Tree branches rattled, bushes rustled, and leaves crumpled, whirling in cyclones as a howling, chilling wind swept in. Michael clenched his blue jacket and zipped it tighter, suddenly thankful that he had decided to wear windbreakers. Jenna had blue jeans and a red jacket, but Michael had no idea if they were also windbreakers. He could only hope that Jenna wasn't freezing. Michael took a moment to scan the environment, then pointed to a pile of stones that encircled an amalgamation of charcoal. "That's an old campfire." Jenna looked over her shoulder, glancing at the campfire by her feet and lifting her left foot on its tiptoes as she realized she was almost stepping on it. She adjusted her footing and turned her gaze back to Michael, her voice both calmer and more anxious at the same time. "Okay, yeah, this is it," Michael thought. Or it was someone else's campsite last night. Jenna pointed toward the other side of the river. "They went that way when they were looking for Fritz." Michael took a few steps forward, then turned his gaze to the ground. He dropped to one knee and examined the mud by his feet. Jenna, her arms still suspended in the air, was about to ask him what he was doing when he looked up to her and said, "Judging by the size and shoe type, these are probably Fritz's footprints." Jenna darted toward Michael, exclaiming, "What?" She slid to a stop in front of Michael, who recoiled and threw up his hands, preparing to catch her if she fell or slammed into him. Jenna knelt down, demanding, "Where do they lead?" Michael's eyes followed the tracks that led to his left. Then he stood up. He took several steps along the footprints, Jenna close at his heels. Then he tilted his head in confusion. He knelt down again, stroking his gloved fingers across the small tracks. Jenna knelt down next to Michael, trying to see if there was anything she could make out. "What is it?" Michael glanced at Jenna. "They end here." Jenna's eyes widened. "What do you mean they end here?" Michael turned his gaze back to the footprints. "I mean, Fritz stopped walking at this point. Maybe someone carried him. Look at those tracks." He pointed to the large, oval-shaped tracks that were almost on top of Fritz's. "I think someone found him." Jenna breathed heavily. "What do you mean someone found him? What are you pointing at? I don't see any tracks." "They're hard to see. Looks like someone tried to cover them up." Jenna shot up as she whirled on Michael. "Cover them up? Michael, are you saying he was kidnapped?" Michael held up his hands. "I don't know. All I know is that I'm positive that those are human tracks, just in a weird shape. And they end where Fritz's tracks end." "How can you tell?" "They're not deep enough to be any animal with feet that big. Plus," Jenna cut him off, "you just said they've been covered up. Of course they're not deep." Michael pointed back to the footprints. "And if you look closely, you can see that it's bipedal." Jenna stared at the ground again, tilting her head, probably trying to see if she could spot the shallow footprints in the ground. "So someone carried him?" Michael shrugged as he stood up, rubbing his hands together in an attempt to warm them. "Either that, or he decided to walk on rocks, and those marks aren't tracks at all. But if someone did carry him, that'd explain why Fritz's tracks end here, and someone else has come up to his." He pointed in front of him. "Then lead away, in that direction." Jenna gestured roughly in the direction the tracks headed. "Well, let's follow them." Jenna started in the direction she pointed, then stopped when Michael called, "Wait!" Jenna whirled around to see Michael slowly turning in a circle, scanning the tree line. She opened her mouth to ask what Michael was doing when he asked, "Could Fritz find his way back here?" Jenna shook her head. "No, he's terrible with direction." Michael quickly glanced around the tree line again. "Still, I think we should check real quick." Michael couldn't tell if Jenna was annoyed or impatient. Either way, she nodded. "Okay." Michael glanced back down at Fritz's footprints and followed them backwards, hoping to find where Fritz started walking from. He briefly looked up at Jenna. "I'll check around to see if there's any sign he came back, and then we'll go follow those tracks." Jenna nodded, shivering in either cold or anxiety. "Okay." Michael stopped as Fritz's footprints ended again, and he glanced at the dirt on either side of them. He noticed the small holes in the dirt, where pegs must have been hammered in. Unsurprisingly, Fritz came out of the tent. Michael tried to reconstruct the scene in his mind. Fritz emerged from the tent and walked toward whoever was outside. Judging by the way the tracks were laid out, both Fritz and the person were calm, or at least not hasty, and there were no signs of any struggle. As Michael pondered it, he gazed at the tree line again and walked toward it, scanning for any evidence that Fritz, or anyone, could be nearby. Alice sat on her bed, her face in her hands. Anthony stood in front of her, the desire to comfort her swelling up inside him, but he was unsure what to say. Alice placed her hands in her lap and looked up at Anthony. "What did you find?" Anthony pretended not to notice that it was the second time she had asked, and tried to speak reassuringly. "He definitely wasn't at the river. He went deeper into the woods." "How far?" Anthony shrugged, almost shivering. "I don't know, but he couldn't have gone too far." "How do you know that?" "Because I'm a detective, and I know him." Alice looked back at her lap and wiped a tear from her eye. "What else did you find?" Anthony paused, having a sudden memory of the almost perfect rectangle in the ground. It reminded him of an empty grave, like someone dug up a coffin. Since Bane was fiercely growling and barking at the grave, and the dirt at the bottom of it was incredibly loose, as if it had been dug the night before, Anthony was filled with the sudden, blood-curdling idea that Fritz was buried alive. Without a second thought, Anthony jumped into the grave and sank into the soil as if he had fallen off a cliff. Anthony's face was bombarded with dirt. He coughed and blinked rapidly as he felt it seep into his eyes and throat. He quickly thrust himself above the loose dirt, gasping for air. He hadn't realized that Jaden was yelling until he exclaimed, "You okay?" Anthony ignored him. Instead, knee-deep in the earth, he hunched over and walked to the end of the grave as if walking through water, waving his hands from side to side in an attempt to feel every inch of the grave. After he reached the other side, he straightened and turned to Jaden. "Nothing's here." Jaden, who was kneeling down with his arm extended, repeated, "Are you okay?" Anthony nodded, gesturing to himself with his hands. "Yes, I'm fine." He didn't intentionally sound irritated, but he didn't care. Anthony walked over to Jaden and took his hand. After Jaden helped Anthony out of the hole, he gazed at the grave in confusion. "So Fritz's scent leads here?" He shook his head. "That's odd." Anthony turned to Jaden. "What does it mean?" Jaden shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe Bane just didn't get a good enough scent?" Anthony asked urgently, "Want to try something else of Fritz's?" Jaden nodded. "Sure." He glanced at the other officers one by one. "You boys keep looking. Anthony and I will try to get Fritz's scent again." As the officers set off into the woods, Jaden and Anthony started back toward the campsite. Jaden whistled, calling, "Bane, come on, boy." A moment passed before Jaden glanced over his shoulder, realizing that Bane hadn't moved an inch. Jaden stopped and turned toward Bane. "Bane, come here, boy." Bane stood on the steep edge of the deep grave, still barking at it ferociously. Jaden took cautious steps toward Bane. "Bane?" He clapped his hands and whistled again as he approached Bane, raising his voice. "Bane?" He knelt down next to Bane, scanned the bottom of the grave, then turned his gaze to Anthony. "You're sure nothing's down there?" Anthony started toward Jaden. "Not that I found." Jaden sat on the edge of the grave, then slid down into it, sinking to his waist in the loose soil. He traversed the grave, searching the same way that Anthony did. As Jaden started back toward Anthony, he shrugged. "Nope, Nothing in here. After Jaden took Anthony's hand and was back out of the grave, he brushed the dust off his uniform with his hands and turned to Bane. What's your deal? Jaden had to grab Bane by the collar and to drag him away from the grave. At first, Bane resisted, yanking himself away from his owner. But he soon gave up and trotted alongside Jaden, whose fist still clung tightly around his collar. After a long, determined jog, Anthony arrived at the campsite, where there was no sign of his wife or kids. He was gripped with a sudden, painful longing, wanting to comfort them all, to try to get them to believe that everything was okay. Memories of Fritz flashed through his mind. He remembered the first time he held him as an infant, his first words, his first steps, his first crayon drawings. Anthony and Jaden repeatedly searched what was left of the campsite. They gave Bane toys, clothing, anything they could find of Fritz's. Everything led back to the same rectangular incision, engraved in the earth like a grisly scar. When nightfall approached, and Jaden was helping Anthony pack the tents and toys into his car, all Anthony could think about was the possibility of Fritz somehow being in the grave, but he wasn't able to find him. He didn't think it was true, but it kept nagging at his horrified mind like a fiery knife. Alice asked, "Anthony?" Anthony blinked, bringing himself to the present. He looked to Alice, who was staring at him with a deep concern. Tears in her eyes, she asked, "Are you okay? What did you find?" Anthony shook his head. "Nothing helpful." Alice persisted, "But what?" Anthony shrugged. "Just leaves, dirt, and trees." He walked over to the bed and sat next to Alice. "We'll keep looking. We'll find him." Suddenly, Alice clasped Anthony in a tight hug and cried into his chest. Anthony hugged back, feeling tears streak down his face. Michael expected the footprints to become more visible as they got further away from the campsite, because he assumed that whoever covered them up would have gotten tired eventually. But Michael frequently had to stop and check to make sure he was still following the same trail. His internal monologue went on. "Did someone else come and try to cover up all these tracks? But there's only one set of tracks. Was there only one person, and whoever carried Fritz walked backward on their own footprints as they covered them?" Michael hoped that they were still following the right tracks, but it was hard to be sure. His mind raced. Did someone actually try to cover them up? Is that even what happened? It's obviously human footprints, but they're too shallow. So shallow I almost didn't even spot them. After what felt like an eternity, Michael and Jenna stopped dead in their tracks. In front of them was a tree, leaning to the side precariously as a huge chunk had been ripped from its side. Long strips of wood curling outward from the laceration. Michael glared at the tree, then scanned the carnage of leaves and bark on the ground, trying to understand what he was seeing. Jenna pointed at it. "What is that?" Michael walked up to the tree, constantly glancing upward to make sure it wasn't gonna fall on him. He stroked his finger along the wound, mountain ranges of sharp, jagged wood, and rivers of oozing sap running from top to bottom of it. Michael knelt down and cleared some of the foliage away from his feet to see that the person's tracks were still there. He envisioned the faceless man walking in the footprints. They appeared to go straight through the massive gap in the tree. Puzzled, Michael stood up and turned to Jenna. "I guess he stopped to beat up the tree, then kept going straight?" Jenna threw her hands outward toward the tree, her flashlight dancing in the darkness. "What? Why would he do that? And could someone even do that? Michael shrugged. The tree's not dead, so he probably used a tool. Jenna walked up to Michael. Why? Michael turned back to the tree. I don't know. Jenna's eyes widened. Could it have been an animal? Were we tracking an animal this whole time? Michael pointed at the tree. No animal that lives here can do that. He pointed to the footprints. And those are human tracks. They're wearing weird shoes, but definitely human. Jenna knelt down and followed the faint footprints with her eyes. Could whoever it was have just ran through it? Michael turned to Jenna. What? No. Even if the tree's dead, you'd have to hit it pretty hard to do that. He turned back to the tree again, pondering. I guess it's possible if it was dead, though. He pointed at the tree again. But it was alive when this happened. And whoever it was walking, so no. How do you know that? Michael looked down, pointing back to the tracks. Look at how they're shaped, and how they're spaced. Whoever it was calm, or at least not in any hurry. Jenna was silent for a moment, then asked, What does it mean? Michael turned to Jenna. I don't know. Alice couldn't sleep with the pain in her chest, the sickness in her gut, or the lump in her throat. She sat on the edge of her bed and held a photo album on her lap. She flipped through the pages quietly, trying not to wake Anthony, who was sleeping behind her on the bed. She gazed at each of the pictures for long moments, taking in the image of her son. In all the photos, Fritz seemed so happy. In some, he was playing with friends and posing with Jenna in others. As Alice went through them, memories surged through her mind. She remembered 6-year-old Jenna kissing Fritz, holding him, and singing him to sleep in his crib. She recalled how Fritz was always intent on making sure everyone was smiling, and how him and Jenna were always there when the other was crying. She recalled Fritz's birthdays, his Christmases, his joy, his heartwarming laughter, his beautiful smile. Alice wiped a tear from her eye, then closed the photo album. She set it on the nightstand and gazed down at her lap. She shook her head and laid back down in bed, pulling her sheets up to her neck. She tried to fall asleep despite the lump in her throat, the sickness in her stomach, and the heartache in her chest. Michael and Jenna kept following the trail to the best of their ability. After a while, Michael finally turned on his headlamp, his eyes admitting defeat to the darkness. The world shifted to monochrome, the night sucking the color from it like a bloodthirsty vampire. Michael stumbled through an amalgamation of bushes and branches, then quickly slid to a stop, flailing his arms wildly as he careened forward, then caught his balance and took a step back. Jenna stopped beside him and stared down with widened eyes. In the ground was a deep, rectangular pit. After scanning it with her flashlight, Jenna turned her gaze to Michael. What is that? Michael shook his head. I have no idea. He looked up from the grave, then tilted his head, adjusting his viewpoint to make sure he knew what he was looking at. Then he pointed at the other side of the pit. But the tracks continue on the other side. He looked down at his feet, noticing the shallow footprints beneath him, and glanced back at the other tracks, on the other side. Did the guy just jump into the hole? By the edge of the gaping mouth of the pit, Michael noticed faint incisions and scuffs, as if someone had climbed out of it. Michael contemplated. But why would someone go into the hole and climb out of it? Wouldn't they just go around it? Michael walked around the fissure and knelt down next to the footprints that were on the other side. He stared for a long moment, stroking his fingers along the tracks before looking up at Jenna. They end here. Trembling, Jenna stared at Michael. What do you mean they end there? Michael stood up, glaring down at the footprints. I mean... He gestured to the tracks beneath his feet and turned his gaze back to Jenna. They end here. Jenna blurted. But they can't just end. They have to lead somewhere. Michael stared down at the footprints. Well, weathering can cover them up. Then he froze. Michael knelt back down, stroking the tracks again. Wait. Jenna's eyes widened again. What? Michael gestured to the footprints again. They're pointed toward the hole. He turned his gaze back to Jenna. He didn't go down in it and climb up again from this side. He gestured in the direction that the tracks beneath him were facing, toward the hole. He went in this way. He gestured in the opposite direction. And that way. He went in the hole twice, from different sides. Jenna stared down at the hole, her body vibrating. Is he... She stopped. Jenna sat on the edge of the gaping laceration, then pushed off into the pit. She immediately submerged as if something yanked her down, engulfing her in the earth. She screamed, gasping for air, dirt flying down her throat. Michael shouted, Jenna! End of chapter 4.